I came out of anesthesia to the steady beep of a monitor and the weight of something pulling at my abdomen, a deep, tearing pressure that made my breath catch before I could even open my eyes. And the first thing I understood was that this pain was not normal. Soreness. Not the dull ache people describe after routine surgery, but a sharp internal warning that something inside me had been torn and stitched back together in a hurry. The air smelled like antiseptic and plastic. And when I finally forced my eyelids apart, the ceiling lights above me were too bright, turning the room into a washed-out blur where voices floated in and out like they belonged to someone else. A nurse noticed I was awake and leaned over me, her face calm in the practiced way of someone trained to deliver bad news gently. She told me the surgery was over, that I was stable now, that I needed to stay still. Stable was a strange word to hear when my body felt like it had been split open and taped together by strangers who had met me less than an hour earlier. I tried to ask what had happened, but my throat was dry and my voice came out thin and cracked barely more than air. She told me the surgeon would explain everything soon, then adjusted the tube draining fluid from my side, and that movement sent a bolt of pain through me so sudden I cried out despite myself. That was when the surgeon appeared at the foot of the bed. A tall man with tired eyes who looked like he had already replayed this conversation in his head and did not enjoy it. He did not waste time with euphemisms. He told me I had suffered a rupture along my abdominal wall, that there had been internal bleeding, that the damage matched a force applied to tissue that had already been weakened. He said it clearly clinically, like he was documenting a fact rather than offering an opinion. This was not a freak accident. This kind of injury happens when force is applied to a weakened abdominal wall. As he spoke, the room seemed to tilt, not from dizziness, but from understanding, because 8 months earlier I had undergone a laparoscopic procedure to repair a minor but real issue in that same area, and I had told my family about it, had explained the recovery had been careful for weeks afterward because the doctors warned me that healing tissue needed time. My brother Ethan knew this. He knew it as well as I did. The surgeon kept talking, explaining timelines and risks and recovery plans, but his words blurred together as my mind filled with another sound entirely. The echo of laughter carried on warm summer air, the sharp smell of beer and grilled meat by the lake, the way everyone had been smiling just hours earlier, as if nothing in the world could possibly go wrong. I remembered the deck, the water glinting in the late afternoon sun, the familiar feeling of unease settling into my chest when Ethan clapped his hands and announced he had an idea. He had always liked ideas that involved an audience. I remembered him stepping behind me, his hands firm on my waist, lifting and twisting me off the ground in one quick motion, while people laughed and someone shouted my name like it was all part of a show. I remembered the sudden white flash of pain when his grip shifted just enough to press into the spot that still ached sometimes when I moved the wrong way, the way my breath had left me in a sharp, involuntary sound as my body folded in on itself. I remembered saying his name again, louder this time, not laughing, not smiling, and him rolling his eyes as he set me back on my feet. He had shrugged and said it was nothing, that he barely touched me, that I needed to relax. I could hear his voice even now, clear, as if he were standing at the foot of my hospital bed instead of somewhere else entirely. I barely touched you. Everyone had laughed because laughter was easier than asking why I had gone pale, easier than noticing the way my hands shook when I tried to straighten up, easier than admitting that something had crossed a line. Someone handed me a drink I did not take. Someone else joked that I always made things dramatic. I tried to stand on my own, told myself the pain would pass, that I did not want to be the problem at yet another family gathering. The memory jumped forward in sharp pieces, the nausea that followed cold and heavy. The way the pain did not fade but grew, spreading like fire under my skin. My mother telling me to sit down and stop worrying everyone. Ethan smirking, telling people I was milking it, that I loved attention. I remembered lying on the couch staring at the ceiling fan as it spun, counting rotations to distract myself from the pressure building inside my abdomen, the sense that something was very wrong and no one wanted to hear it. I remembered the moment a neighbor knocked on the door after hearing me retch in the yard, the way her face changed when she saw me folded over and shaking the way she did not ask permission before calling for help. The siren had been loud and humiliating, cutting through the quiet of the lake like an accusation, and even then, Ethan had laughed, shaking his head as if this were all an overreaction that would make a funny story later. Back in the hospital room, the surgeon finished explaining and asked if I had any questions. I had hundreds, but only one mattered, and it sat heavy in my chest as I stared at the sterile white walls and felt the pull of stitches beneath the bandage. I asked him if I would have died without surgery. He did not hesitate. "Yes," he said eventually. "Internal bleeding is unpredictable. Another delay could have been fatal." When he left, the room felt too quiet, and I closed my eyes as tears finally slid down the sides of my face, not from pain alone, but from the cold clarity settling in. Ethan did not mean to kill me. He just did not care if I lived. Growing up in my family, I learned early that pain was something to apologize for, not something to name, and by the time I was old enough to understand tone and timing, I already knew that my job was to stay small. My parents liked to say I was delicate, and they said it with a smile as if it were a compliment instead of a warning label. Delicate meant I cried too easily, flinched when voices rose, and reacted strongly to things other kids shrugged off without thinking. My older brother Ethan was everything I was not, loud, confident, solid in his own body, and certain that the world would bend if he pushed hard enough. From the start, the difference between us was treated like a personality quirk instead of a power imbalance. When Ethan ran through the house and knocked into furniture, my parents laughed. When I followed more carefully and still got hurt, they sighed and told me to be more aware. If Ethan grabbed my arm too hard during play, my father waved it off and said, "Boys play rough." If I pulled away, my mother told me I was too sensitive and asked why I could not take a joke. Those moments were small on their own, but together they built a pattern that taught me what was acceptable to notice and what was not. I learned that Ethan's intentions mattered more than my pain, and that his laughter could erase almost anything. By elementary school, the label had hardened. Teachers used it when they worried about stress. Relatives used it when they wanted to explain why I did not fit the family image of resilience. Doctors used it carefully when they talked about anxiety or recovery. No one asked why my body stayed tense or why my reactions seemed outsized to them. They only saw the result, not the cause. Ethan learned quickly how much room he had. He learned that space adjusted to him and that people laughed when he crossed lines as long as he called it fun. He learned that if I protested, he could roll his eyes and let the room decide which of us was being unreasonable. I learned to step back. I learned to watch where I was going even when he was the one barreling through hallways. I learned to swallow pain quietly because expressing it only shifted attention from what happened to how I reacted. Complaining turned me into the problem, and silence kept the peace. At family gatherings, Ethan told stories that always ended with laughter and always placed me at the center of the joke. How I cried when he hid my backpack, how I could not handle roughhousing, how I needed special treatment. Each story painted him as playful and me as breakable, and each time I smiled because contradicting him only made the room uncomfortable. The word fragile followed me everywhere, and it shaped how I saw myself long before I had the language to challenge it. When I went away to college, the distance gave me perspective I did not know I needed. I realized that what I had been calling sensitivity was actually vigilance. I noticed details others ignored and felt shifts in tone before arguments erupted. I read rooms quickly because I had learned that anticipation was safer than reaction. That skill followed me into my work and helped me build a life that made sense to me even when it confused my family. Still, every visit home pulled me back into the old roles. Ethan remained the center, and I remained the one expected to accommodate. When I tried to explain boundaries, my parents framed it as rejection. When I asked for care, they heard criticism. The pattern never changed, only the context did. By the time I was 28, the story of who I was had been written so many times by other people that even I had started to believe it. I told myself I was careful because I had to be, and that there was nothing wrong with that. I did not realize how much that belief depended on everyone else agreeing to ignore what happened when Ethan crossed the line again and again. I did not yet understand that being labeled delicate had given him permission to be reckless. I thought I was protecting myself by staying quiet. I did not know that silence was teaching him that there would never be consequences. Ethan liked to call what he did playing, and everyone else seemed relieved to accept that explanation because it kept things simple and harmless on the surface. From the outside, it looked like teasing and roughhousing, the kind of behavior people expect from siblings who grew up close in age. What no one wanted to examine was how often his play required my discomfort to land as funny. He did not joke with words alone. He used his body and his size and his certainty that nothing bad would happen to him. He flicked my ear hard enough to sting and laughed when I jumped. He shoved past me in narrow spaces and grinned when I stumbled. He grabbed my wrist mid-sentence to interrupt me and let go only after I stopped talking. Each time it was framed as nothing, and each time I was expected to laugh it off. When I did not, he accused me of ruining the mood. When I protested, he told me I was imagining things. This was the pattern. Action followed by dismissal, followed by pressure to move on. Over time, the jokes became physical in a way that made my stomach tighten even before anything happened. He liked sudden movements and surprise touches because they got reactions. He liked knowing he could control the room with a single gesture. I noticed how his eyes tracked me during gatherings, waiting for an opening a moment when attention was high and boundaries were low. He never acted alone. There was always an audience. He understood instinctively that witnesses protected him as long as they were laughing. Once, during a holiday dinner, he came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my shoulders in what he called a hug, then lifted slightly until my feet barely touched the floor. My breath caught, and I froze, and everyone laughed because it looked affectionate. When he set me down, I asked him not to do that again. He rolled his eyes and told me to lighten up. My mother nodded as if that settled it. Another time he nudged me toward the pool at a backyard party, pretending he might push me in. People laughed at the threat. I laughed too because I did not want to be the only one tense. When I slipped on the wet concrete and scraped my arm, he shrugged and said accidents happen. These moments stacked quietly year after year until I could feel them before they occurred. I learned to position myself near walls and furniture. I learned to keep objects between us when I could. I learned to leave rooms early. None of this registered as concern to my family because I did it without complaint. Ethan liked to test limits, and he liked to pretend he did not know where they were. When I tried to articulate what bothered me, he reduced it to tone and intent. He did not mean anything by it, so nothing could be wrong. That logic became a shield. It meant he never had to adjust his behavior because the burden was always on me to interpret it differently. My parents absorbed that reasoning because it allowed them to avoid conflict. They wanted harmony more than accountability. If I stayed quiet, things stayed calm. If I spoke up, things got uncomfortable. The choice was always clear. I learned to survive by minimizing myself, and by the time I was an adult, the habit felt natural. Even when I moved out and built a life that required confidence and precision, those family dynamics snapped back into place the moment I crossed the threshold of home. Ethan treated my independence like a challenge. He liked to remind me that he had known me longer than anyone else and that he could still make me react if he wanted to. He called it nostalgia. I called it exhaustion. Looking back now, I see that his jokes were never accidental because they followed the same script every time. There was anticipation, then action, then laughter, then dismissal. There was no room in that script for my consent. There was no curiosity about how it landed. The joke only worked if I absorbed the impact quietly. The family reinforced it by rewarding his confidence and critiquing my response. That reinforcement taught him that he could escalate without consequence. It taught me that resistance would only isolate me further. By the time that weekend at the lake arrived, the groundwork had been laid so thoroughly that no one questioned his behavior in the moment. Not because it was harmless, but because it was familiar. They had been trained to see it that way, and so had I. I walked into that house already carrying the weight of every joke that had come before, and I still told myself it would be fine. That belief was not optimism. It was conditioning. I did not want to go to the lake house that weekend, and the fact that I could not give a reason that sounded acceptable to my parents made me feel childish before the conversation even started. On paper, there was nothing wrong with the plan. It was a short drive, a familiar place, a chance to relax before summer ended. My mother framed it as a reset, and my father said it would be good for everyone to spend time together. Ethan had already confirmed he would be there, and that alone tightened something in my chest. I could not explain without sounding dramatic. When I hesitated, my mother laughed softly and said I always worried too much. She reminded me that I was an adult now and that I could handle being around my own brother for a weekend. The implication was clear. If I said no, it would not be about logistics or comfort, it would be about me being difficult again. I told myself I was tired of being the person who complicated things. I packed a small bag, drove out early, and promised myself I would keep my distance and leave if I needed to. The lake house looked the same as it always had, white siding weathered just enough to feel permanent wide windows facing the water, a deck that wrapped around the back where people gathered with drinks and told stories they had already told before. When I arrived, the air smelled like sunscreen and grilled food, and the sound of laughter carried easily across the water. My parents hugged me, my mother commenting on how thin I looked, my father asking about work and whether I was sleeping enough. Ethan was already there, leaning against the railing with a beer in his hand, talking loudly to someone I did not recognize. When he saw me, he grinned and opened his arms like he expected applause. I stayed just out of reach and waved instead. He raised his eyebrows but said nothing, then turned back to his story. That small victory felt temporary and fragile, and it set the tone for the rest of the afternoon. People drifted in and out of conversations, music played softly from a speaker, and for a while I almost believed I had been wrong to dread the weekend. I kept busy helping my mother in the kitchen and chatting with a neighbor who asked polite questions and did not touch me unexpectedly. Still, there was an undercurrent I could feel whenever Ethan's voice rose or laughter spiked suddenly. I noticed how my parents relaxed when he was holding court and how they tensed when attention shifted away from him. It was subtle, but it was there, and it reminded me of why I had learned to stay quiet in the first place. As the day wore on, the alcohol flowed more freely, and the tone shifted just enough to make me uneasy. Jokes got louder and boundaries blurred in the way they often do when people want to stretch the moment and make it last. Ethan grew more animated, gesturing broadly, stepping into people's space, clapping hands to punctuate his points. At one point, he came over and flicked the back of my shoulder as he passed, making a comment about how serious I looked. I forced a smile and told him I was fine. He laughed and told everyone to loosen up. My mother shot me a look that said, "Please do not start anything." I nodded and took a step back closer to the edge of the deck where there was less traffic. I checked my phone a few times, considering whether I could invent a reason to leave early without causing a scene. Each time, I talked myself out of it. I told myself nothing had happened yet and that leaving preemptively would only confirm the version of me everyone already expected. I reminded myself that I was stronger than I used to be and that I could manage a few hours. That was the lie I kept returning to because it was easier than confronting the truth that my body was already bracing for impact. As evening approached, the light shifted and the air cooled slightly, and someone suggested a group photo by the water. People gathered close, arms around shoulders, glasses raised. I positioned myself near the edge again, trying to maintain space without being obvious. Ethan moved through the group with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. He joked about arranging people then, about making it interesting. When he stepped behind me, I felt it before I saw it, the familiar prickle along my spine, the sense that something was about to happen and that no one would stop it. I told myself not to overreact, not to move, not to draw attention. The camera came out and someone counted down and laughter swelled in anticipation. That was the moment everyone wanted me to pretend nothing was wrong, and that was the moment I realized pretending had always been the price of belonging. Ethan waited until everyone was focused on the camera before he moved, and that timing was not an accident, even if he would later claim it was. The photographer was backing up toward the water, telling people to squeeze closer, and someone joked about falling in, which made everyone laugh and lean in. I felt Ethan's presence behind me more clearly than I felt the breeze off the lake, a subtle shift in the air that made my shoulders tense before my mind caught up. His hands came down on my sides, fast and firm, and before I could step away, he lifted me slightly and twisted, like he was setting up a playful spin. To anyone watching, it probably looked like harmless enthusiasm, the kind of moment that turns into a funny picture, but the force of it drove straight into the spot my body had never fully trusted again. The pain was immediate and blinding, a sharp, tearing sensation that stole my breath and folded me forward on instinct. I made a sound I did not recognize, and my hands grabbed at his arms, not to push him, but to anchor myself as the world narrowed. Ethan laughed and set me back on my feet like he had proven a point, telling everyone I startled easily and that he barely touched me. The word barely landed wrong, hollow and dismissive, and it took effort to stay upright as the pressure inside my abdomen grew heavier by the second. People laughed because he laughed, and because the idea that something serious had just happened would have ruined the picture they wanted. Someone snapped the photo. Someone else clapped. I bent at the waist, pretending to adjust my shoe, because it was easier than explaining why my vision had gone white around the edges. My mother asked if I was okay with the same tone she used when she wanted reassurance, not truth. I nodded because shaking my head would have required words, and words felt impossible in that moment. Ethan leaned close and told me to relax and stop making it weird, his breath warm with alcohol, his voice low enough that it sounded like advice instead of a warning. I tried to straighten up, and when I did, the pain surged again deeper this time, spreading in a way that made me nauseous. I stepped away from the group and sat down hard on a nearby chair, gripping the edge as if that might keep everything inside me where it belonged. My heart was racing, not with fear, yet, but with shock as my body tried to make sense of what had just happened. I told myself it would pass, that I had felt pain before and survived it, that I did not want to give Ethan the satisfaction of seeing me react. Minutes stretched thin, and the pain did not ease. It settled and then intensified, a hot, insistent ache that made my skin clammy and my thoughts slow. When I stood again, my legs wobbled, and someone joked that I should drink some water. Ethan smirked and said I always milked things. My father laughed politely and told me to sit down and stop worrying people. I wanted to scream that this was different, but the words tangled with the fear that if I spoke and was wrong, I would never hear the end of it. I moved inside the house under the pretense of needing the bathroom and leaned against the counter, breathing shallowly as nausea rose in waves. I could hear laughter outside through the open door, and the sound felt unreal, like it belonged to another life. I tried to assess myself the way I would, any data point noticing the location of the pain, the way it radiated, the way it worsened when I moved. I knew enough about my own history to recognize that this was not a pulled muscle or a bruise. Something had given way. When I told my mother I did not feel well, she sighed and said I had probably eaten too fast. When I told Ethan I needed him to listen, he rolled his eyes and said I was being dramatic again. The word again hit harder than the pain because it reminded me how little space there was for anything that contradicted his version of events. As the evening wore on, the light faded and my condition worsened. I started shaking uncontrollably, and the nausea became vomiting that left me weak and dizzy. People grew uncomfortable, then annoyed, as if my body were an inconvenience interrupting their plans. Someone suggested I lie down and sleep it off. Ethan laughed and told them I always bounced back. I curled on the couch, focusing on my breathing while pressure built inside me like a tide that refused to recede. Every instinct told me this was dangerous and that waiting was making it worse. But the weight of years pressed down just as hard as the pain did the unspoken rule that I should not escalate things, that I should not make a scene. I lay there listening to my family talk over me and realized with a clarity that cut through everything else that Ethan had known exactly where to put his hands and exactly how hard to move me. He knew because I had told him, and because he had been there after my surgery, and because he had joked about it then too. This was not a miscalculation. It was a choice. The pain did not fade the way everyone kept promising it would, and instead it spread with a methodical cruelty that felt almost instructional, as if my body were trying to teach me a lesson I could not ignore anymore. I tried lying still and then sitting up and then curling onto my side, and nothing helped. Each position brought a new wave of nausea and pressure, and the sense that something inside me was no longer where it belonged. I asked for a glass of water and could not keep it down. I asked for a blanket because I was shaking even though the room was warm. My mother told me to breathe and relax and said anxiety could make anything feel worse. Ethan stood near the doorway watching with a look that mixed annoyance and disbelief, like he was trying to decide whether this inconvenience was worth engaging with. He told my parents she always does this and shrugged as if that explained everything. I focused on the sound of the clock on the wall counting seconds because it was easier than focusing on the pain or the realization that no one was listening. When I tried to stand again, my vision blurred and I grabbed the counter to keep from falling. My father told me to sit down and stop scaring people, and I wanted to ask who exactly I was scaring because everyone else seemed more irritated than concerned. The vomiting continued, and with it came a weakness that made my arms feel heavy and uncooperative. I could taste bile and copper and something sour that did not belong there. I asked quietly if we could go to the hospital, and the room went still for a moment before filling with objections. "It is far," they said. "It is late," they said. "We will see how you feel in the morning," they said. Ethan laughed and told me to stop being dramatic and that I had probably pulled something and would feel silly when it passed. The word silly lodged somewhere deep and sharp. I tried again to explain that this felt different, that the pain was worsening, not easing, and that I felt lightheaded in a way that scared me. My mother pressed her lips together and said calling for help would cause a scene and that neighbors would talk. She said, "Let us give it a little time." Time became an enemy. Minutes dragged, and each one added weight to the pressure inside me. I curled back onto the couch and tried to stay conscious by naming objects in the room in my head because drifting felt dangerous. The sound of laughter outside had faded, but the energy of the evening lingered like a residue that made my suffering feel out of place. I heard Ethan tell someone that I always bounced back and that there was no need to overreact. My father nodded like this was reasonable. I felt alone in a way that was colder than fear. When I tried to reach for my phone, my hands shook too much to unlock it. I asked for help again, and my mother sighed and told me to stop fixating. She told me to think positive and rest. I realized then that they had already decided the story they wanted to tell and that my pain did not fit it. The pressure intensified into something sharp and relentless, and I cried out despite myself. That sound finally changed the room, but not in the way I hoped. My father told me to keep it down, and Ethan snapped that I was making a big deal out of nothing. I heard a knock at the door then, and someone called my mother's name. A neighbor had come by to return something and had heard me through the open window. She asked if everything was okay, and my mother started to answer automatically that yes, everything was fine, until the neighbor stepped inside and took one look at me. She did not hesitate. She said, "This does not look fine," and asked if I wanted her to call for help. The relief that washed over me was immediate and humiliating. I nodded because I could not speak without retching again. My mother protested that it was not necessary and that we were handling it. The neighbor was firm. She said she had worked as a nurse for years and that something was wrong. Ethan scoffed and said she was overreacting too. The neighbor ignored him and asked me directly if I wanted emergency services. I nodded again and felt tears slide down my face, not from pain, but from the sudden clarity that someone finally believed me. When she made the call, my mother wrung her hands and my father paced, and Ethan muttered about liability and drama and how ridiculous this all was. The sirens took too long to arrive, and every second felt stretched and thin. I focused on breathing shallowly because deeper breaths sent knives through my abdomen. When the responders arrived, they asked questions quickly and efficiently and did not dismiss me when I struggled to answer. They checked my vitals and exchanged looks that told me what my family would not. This was serious. As they prepared to move me, Ethan protested again, saying this was unnecessary and that I was embarrassing everyone. One of the responders looked at him and said, "Sir, please step back." The authority in that voice felt like a door opening. As they lifted me onto the stretcher, the pain flared so intensely that I screamed, and the sound cut through the house like a truth no one could ignore anymore. My mother cried then, and my father went pale, and Ethan fell silent. It was too late for explanations and too late for minimizing. Whatever had happened was no longer a joke, and the delay had already taken its toll. As the doors closed and the sirens started, I realized that waiting had not protected anyone. It had only made the damage worse. The ambulance smelled like antiseptic and rubber, and the sharp metallic tang of urgency, and as soon as the doors closed, the world narrowed to the rhythm of the siren and the measured voices of the EMTs working around me. One of them knelt beside the stretcher and asked my name, my age, and where the pain was worst, and even answering those simple questions felt like pushing against resistance. I told them my abdomen and pointed weakly to the spot just above my hip where the pressure felt most unbearable. They checked my blood pressure and exchanged another look that did not go unnoticed. It was low and falling. Someone started an IV and explained what they were doing in a calm, steady voice that anchored me when everything else felt like it was slipping. They asked if I had hit my head or fallen, and I shook my head. They asked if anyone had struck me, and I hesitated just long enough to feel the weight of the years press down again. I said my brother lifted and twisted me. One of them wrote it down without comment, and that lack of judgment felt like oxygen. They pressed gently on my abdomen, and I cried out and apologized reflexively for the sound. The EMT told me not to apologize and said pain was information. That sentence landed harder than anything else because no one in my family had ever treated my pain like data worth recording. As the ambulance sped toward the hospital, I stared at the ceiling and focused on the small details, the way I always did when things felt out of control. The hum of the engine, the click of equipment, the way the lights flickered as we turned corners. The EMT told me they were concerned about internal bleeding and that they needed to get me evaluated quickly. The words internal bleeding sounded clinical and distant and terrifying all at once. I asked if I was going to be okay, and they said they were doing everything they could. They asked about my medical history, and when I mentioned the surgery from 8 months earlier, their posture shifted slightly. They asked what kind, and I told them laparoscopic repair. One of them nodded and said that mattered. I felt a cold clarity settle in. This was not random. This was not my body overreacting. This was something that had been set in motion with force and timing and knowledge. I asked if my family could come with me, and the EMT said they would follow separately. I was grateful for the distance. Alone in that space, I could finally think without managing anyone else's feelings. I could feel the weakness spreading and the nausea ebbing and returning in waves, and I knew I was losing blood even if I could not see it. The EMT told me to stay awake and asked me questions to keep me focused. I answered and listened and tried not to drift. At one point, the siren cut out briefly and the sudden quiet made my ears ring. I wondered how long we had waited and what damage had already been done by that delay. I wondered how easily this could have been prevented if anyone had taken me seriously earlier. The thought made my chest tighten more than the pain did. We pulled into the emergency bay and the doors flew open, and suddenly there were more people, more lights, more urgency. I was transferred quickly and rolled through corridors that blurred together. A nurse asked me again what happened, and I told the same story, and again it was recorded without argument. The repetition mattered. Each retelling fixed the facts in place. Someone mentioned imaging and labs and surgery consult, and the words stacked up into a picture I did not like. I heard someone say rupture and another say hemorrhage, and I squeezed my eyes shut and breathed shallowly. A doctor leaned over me and explained they needed to take me for scans immediately. He asked if I consented, and I nodded. He asked if anyone had intentionally hurt me, and I said my brother knew about my prior surgery. He paused, then nodded and said thank you for telling me. That pause felt significant. It was the first time someone acknowledged that intent mattered. As they wheeled me toward radiology, I saw my parents in the hallway, faces drawn and frightened. My mother reached for my hand, and I pulled away, not out of anger, but out of the need to hold on to the clarity I had found. Ethan stood behind them, arms crossed, jaw tight, and he looked annoyed more than scared. That image seared itself into me. While my body was failing, his concern was how this looked. The scan room was cold and loud, and I lay still while machines whirred around me, mapping damage I could feel but not see. When it was over, they moved quickly again, and a surgeon introduced himself and spoke plainly. He said there was a tear in the abdominal wall and evidence of internal bleeding, and that they needed to operate soon. He said the pattern of injury was consistent with applied force to a weakened area. Hearing it stated so clearly felt like something locking into place. This was no longer ambiguous. This was no longer subjective. My pain had been translated into language the system understood. As they prepped me for surgery, I signed forms with shaking hands and answered more questions. I asked how long I had waited before coming in, and the surgeon said longer than ideal. The words were not accusatory, but they carried weight. As they wheeled me toward the operating room, the lights overhead blurred into a line, and the anesthesiologist told me to count backwards. I remember thinking that whatever happened next, I would not let this be erased. I would not let it be called a joke again. I woke to the sound of my own breathing amplified and uneven, and for a moment I could not tell if the pressure in my abdomen was pain or memory or both. The ceiling above me was a flat institutional white, and the lights were dimmed in a way that suggested night, even though I had no idea what time it was. My throat felt dry and my mouth tasted like plastic and antiseptic, and when I tried to shift my body responded with a heavy resistance that told me something fundamental had changed. A nurse noticed my eyes open and moved closer, telling me I was in recovery and that the surgery was over. The word surgery echoed oddly as if it belonged to someone else. I asked what happened, and my voice came out thin and hoarse and unfamiliar. She told me to rest and said the surgeon would speak to me soon. I lay there listening to monitors and trying to assemble fragments of sensation into a coherent picture. There was a deep ache where sharp pain had been before, and a tightness that made each breath feel deliberate. Tubes tugged lightly when I shifted, and I stopped moving altogether. When the surgeon arrived, he pulled up a chair and spoke calmly without rushing, which I appreciated more than I could explain. He told me they had repaired a ruptured section of my abdominal wall and controlled internal bleeding that had worsened during the delay. He said the injury was consistent with force applied to a weakened area and that it was not the result of a simple fall or strain. He said this plainly without emphasis, as if stating a measurement. I asked if I would be okay, and he said yes, but that recovery would take time and care. I asked if the delay had mattered, and he did not avoid the question. He said earlier intervention would have reduced the extent of the damage and shortened recovery. I closed my eyes and absorbed that. The surgeon asked if I felt safe going home when the time came, and the question caught me off guard. I asked why he was asking, and he said because injuries like this sometimes occur in contexts where safety is an issue, and he wanted to be sure support was in place. I told him the injury happened at a family gathering and that my brother had lifted and twisted me knowing about my prior surgery. He nodded and said he would document the findings carefully. He said documentation mattered. Those words settled something in me that had been vibrating since the ambulance ride. A nurse came by later with paperwork and explained what each line meant and what had been recorded. I asked about the operative report and imaging, and she said they would be available and that I could request copies. I asked her to note the surgeon's explanation in my chart, and she did so without hesitation. Each confirmation felt like a small anchor. When my parents were allowed in, my mother cried and apologized and said she had not realized how serious it was. My father stood stiffly and said the important thing was that I was okay now. Ethan hovered near the doorway and said he was sorry if I got hurt and that he never meant for anything like this to happen. The phrasing struck me immediately. Sorry if I got hurt placed the harm on chance, not action. Never meant for this to happen erased the knowledge he had carried into that moment. I did not respond. The surgeon returned briefly and answered my parents' questions with the same clarity he had given me. He said again that the injury pattern was consistent with applied force to a weakened abdominal wall and that this was not a freak accident. He did not look at Ethan when he said it, but the words hung in the room anyway. Ethan shifted and said it was just a joke, and the surgeon turned then and said, intent aside, the injury met criteria for traumatic rupture. He said jokes do not change tissue mechanics. Silence followed. After they left, I lay awake staring at the wall, replaying the sequence with a new lens. The lift, the twist, the timing, the location. It all aligned in a way that made denial impossible. I thought about how often my reactions had been used to invalidate the events themselves, and how different it felt to have my experience translated into clinical language that could not be argued with. Pain had become evidence. Injury had become data. When the nurse came to check on me, I asked again about reports, and she reassured me that everything was being recorded thoroughly, including the surgeon's assessment. She asked if I wanted a social worker to stop by, and I said yes. That choice felt like stepping onto solid ground. The social worker arrived later and asked me open questions without rushing. She explained options without pressure. She told me that what I described mattered and that the hospital could help ensure my safety and my records. I felt tired in a way that reached into my bones, but also alert in a way I had never felt before. When the anesthesiologist checked in, he apologized that I had woken briefly during recovery and explained what had happened. I told him it was fine. I had needed to hear the surgeon's words while they were still raw. That night, I slept in fragments and woke to the steady beep of monitors and the weight of realization settling fully into place. This had crossed a line that could not be smoothed over with laughter or minimized with tone. The system had seen it for what it was and named it accordingly. By morning, my pain was controlled and my mind was clear. I asked for copies of everything and was told how to obtain them. I asked specific questions and wrote down answers. The nurse smiled gently and said it was good to be informed. I did not tell her that being informed felt like protection. As the day progressed, I felt a shift from fear to resolve. Surgery had taken something from me, but it had also given me something solid to stand on. The truth was no longer fragile. It had been stitched into place. Once the immediate danger passed, my mind did what it had always done best when circumstances turned hostile and uncertain. It organized. Lying in that hospital bed with tubes tugging at my skin and a dull, controlled ache radiating through my abdomen, I began thinking less about how this had happened and more about how it would be recorded, remembered, and challenged. I had learned long ago that events alone were not enough. What mattered was what could be proven and who controlled the narrative. I asked the nurse for a clipboard and a pen and began writing down names, times, and statements while they were still fresh. The EMTs who mentioned internal bleeding, the surgeon who said applied force to a weakened area. The moment my brother called it a joke in front of medical staff. Each detail felt like a thread, and I knew from experience that threads either unravel or they are woven deliberately into something that holds. I requested copies of the imaging studies and the operative report and asked when the finalized physician notes would be available. The nurse explained the process and did not question my intent. She told me patients had the right to their records and that everything would be accessible through the portal once signed. I asked if preliminary notes could be flagged to include the mechanism of injury as reported, and she nodded and said the surgeon had already documented it clearly. That mattered. Mechanism of injury was not a feeling or an opinion. It was a category with implications. I asked for the timestamps showing when I arrived and when imaging occurred and when surgery began. Delay had consequences and timelines told that story without emotion. When the social worker returned, I asked about documenting safety concerns and she explained how her notes would be part of the chart. She asked if I wanted to make a statement, and I said yes and spoke carefully, sticking to facts and sequence and prior knowledge. I said my brother knew about my previous surgery and that he had lifted and twisted me during a group photo. I did not speculate. I did not editorialize. I watched her write and asked to review what she had recorded. She welcomed that and adjusted wording when I clarified. Precision felt grounding. When my parents visited again, my mother asked why I was taking notes, and I told her quietly that I needed accuracy. She said we could talk later, and I said later often becomes never. Ethan came in after them with an expression that tried for concern and landed on irritation. He said I was taking this too far and that everyone knew it was an accident. I asked him to repeat what he had just said, and when he did, I wrote it down verbatim, including the time and who was present. He noticed then and laughed uneasily, asking what I thought I was doing. I told him I was preserving evidence. The word evidence changed the room. He said I was being dramatic, and I wrote that down too. He asked why I was acting like this, and I told him because facts had a way of disappearing in our family unless someone anchored them. When he left, I felt a strange calm settle in. I was not escalating. I was documenting. Over the next day, I continued methodically. I requested lab results and asked a nurse to explain values and trends. I noted hemoglobin levels before and after surgery and what they indicated. I asked the surgeon if he would be willing to provide a brief statement clarifying his assessment of the injury pattern, and he said he would document thoroughly in the chart. He reminded me that hospital records are legal documents. That reminder felt like a hand placed firmly at my back. I asked about photographs and was told that imaging served that purpose and that operative findings were described in detail. I made sure to request copies as soon as they were finalized. I kept my phone charged and backed up notes to a secure folder. This was not paranoia. It was practice. I had spent years working with fragile materials where a single misplaced assumption could ruin something irreplaceable. You do not rush. You do not trust memory. You preserve. My family's version of events began to take shape quickly and predictably. My mother said it was a misunderstanding. My father said we should focus on healing. Ethan said he felt terrible and that he never meant for this to happen. I did not argue. I asked questions. I asked them to clarify what they meant, and I wrote down their answers. When Ethan said he barely touched me, I asked him to describe exactly what he did. He waved his hands and said he lifted and twisted me a little. I asked him to confirm that he knew about my prior surgery, and he said of course everyone knew. I wrote that down too. Each admission was small on its own, but together they formed a picture he could not later deny. I asked a nurse to note when family members were present and what was said when appropriate, and she did so discreetly. No one stopped me. No one told me I could not. By the time I was discharged, I had a folder that contained more than medical records. It contained a timeline, a pattern, and a set of statements that aligned with the clinical findings. As I signed discharge papers, the nurse reminded me to take it easy and avoid strain. I thanked her and said I would. I knew then that taking it easy did not mean letting this slide. It meant moving carefully and deliberately. Preservation was not about vengeance. It was about making sure the truth could not be sanded down into something unrecognizable. When I left the hospital, I carried my body carefully and my records even more so. I had learned that survival is not just about healing tissue. It is about protecting what remains vulnerable long after the pain subsides. People asked later why I did not call emergency services myself the moment the pain started, and the question always carried an assumption that responsibility rested with me alone, as if survival were a solo task instead of a system that responds or fails based on power and credibility. The honest answer is that I understood the dynamics of my family well enough to know what would happen if I made that call inside that house. The moment a dispatcher came on the line, my parents would have rushed to manage the situation, and Ethan would have stepped in to frame the story before help ever arrived. I had seen it happen with smaller incidents enough times to recognize the pattern. Voices would rise, explanations would overlap, and by the time responders walked through the door, there would already be a consensus that nothing serious had occurred. I would be cast as anxious, dramatic, and unreliable, and the call itself would become evidence of overreaction rather than the injury that prompted it. That is how narratives harden in families like mine. Whoever speaks first sets the terms, and whoever sounds calm gets believed. I was in pain and growing weaker, and I knew I could not win a battle of presentation in that state. Calling myself would not have brought clarity. It would have given them time to coordinate. Waiting felt dangerous, but intervening too early without witnesses felt worse. When the neighbor arrived and made the call, it changed everything because she was an outsider with no stake in smoothing things over. Her voice carried authority my family could not override, and when responders arrived, they assessed me directly without filtering my symptoms through familiar doubt. That difference mattered. Later, when I spoke to a civil attorney, he explained why that moment had been pivotal in ways I had only sensed intuitively at the time. He told me that in cases involving family harm, criminal charges often hinge on intent and immediate witness accounts, and that families close ranks quickly when police are called from inside the home. Statements get synchronized. Uncertainty gets weaponized. Without video or neutral witnesses, prosecutors hesitate because reasonable doubt blooms easily in those gaps. Civil cases operate differently. They focus on duty breach causation and damages, and they rely heavily on medical documentation and timelines. My records showed delay worsening injury and an injury pattern consistent with applied force. The attorney said that a civil action would likely hit harder and faster than criminal charges ever would, because it targeted accountability rather than punishment, and because it removed the need to prove motive beyond a reasonable doubt. It would also strip my family of their favorite defense, which was confusion. I asked him if not calling earlier would be used against me, and he said delay is common in family harm cases and often explained by coercion, normalization, and fear of escalation. He said what mattered was that once care was initiated, the facts spoke for themselves. That explanation aligned with what I had lived. Calling myself would have escalated conflict in a space where I had no leverage. Waiting for an external trigger brought help without handing control to the people who had already minimized my pain. There was another layer too, one I had not articulated until much later. Part of me had been trained to defer authority, and part of me had been taught that authority never sided with me unless someone else validated my experience first. The neighbor did that, the EMTs did that, the surgeon did that. Each step transferred credibility from a system that dismissed me to one that recorded me. By the time I could speak clearly, my words landed in a chart, not a living room. That shift was everything. When my parents asked why I did not just call earlier, I told them the truth, which was that I did not trust the outcome if I did. They said that hurt them. I said harm and hurt are not the same. They asked if I was planning to press charges, and I said I was consulting counsel. That word again changed the room. Counsel meant process, and process meant loss of control. Ethan accused me of turning a family issue into a legal one, and I told him injuries become legal when accountability is avoided. He said I was overreacting, and I told him the surgeon had disagreed. He said this would destroy the family, and I said families that survive rely on truth, not silence. The attorney later told me that my restraint had likely preserved the integrity of the evidence. No panicked calls, no heated confrontations, no early statements made under pressure. Just a clean timeline anchored by medical facts and third-party observation. I did not call emergency services myself because doing so would have placed me back inside a dynamic designed to erase me. Waiting for the right moment was not passivity, it was strategy. I did not choose delay because I doubted my pain. I chose it because I understood the system well enough to know when and how to engage it so that my survival would not be rewritten as exaggeration. When the law looks back, it sees records, not intentions, and sequences, not excuses. By the time my case took shape, those sequences were intact and the excuses had nowhere to hide. My family's version of events solidified quickly once it became clear that I was not backing down, and the speed with which it formed was almost impressive in its coordination. Within days, my parents were repeating the same phrases as if they had practiced them together. It was an accident, they said. It was a misunderstanding. Emotions were high. Alcohol was involved. No one intended harm. Each sentence removed agency from Ethan and redistributed it into the fog of circumstance. When I corrected small details, they nodded sympathetically and returned to their script. My mother told me she understood why I was upset, but urged me not to make permanent decisions based on a temporary crisis. My father reminded me that families survive by forgiving and that legal action would only poison relationships that could still be repaired. Ethan apologized in the way people do when they want absolution without consequence. He said he felt terrible that I got hurt and that he never meant for anything serious to happen. He avoided naming what he had done or acknowledging what he knew beforehand. When I asked him to clarify his apology, he grew defensive and said I was twisting his words. He told me I was letting lawyers put ideas in my head. He told me I was making him out to be a villain when he had only been trying to have fun. The gaslighting was subtle enough to sound reasonable to anyone who had not lived inside it for decades. When I pointed out that the surgeon had documented applied force to a weakened area, my parents said doctors are cautious and that language can be interpreted many ways. When I showed them timestamps that proved delay worsened my condition, my mother said hindsight is unfair. When I mentioned the neighbor who called for help, my father said outsiders do not understand family dynamics. Each response deflected responsibility and reframed harm as perception. I noticed how often they spoke about impact on Ethan's future and almost never about my recovery. They asked if I really wanted to ruin his career over one moment. They asked how this would look to extended family. They asked why I could not accept that mistakes happen. I answered carefully and documented each conversation afterward, noting dates and phrasing because the pattern itself was evidence. Ethan oscillated between contrition and anger depending on the audience. In private, he accused me of betrayal and said I was choosing money over blood. In front of my parents, he softened and said he loved me and wanted to move forward. When I did not respond as expected, he lashed out and said I had always been fragile and that this was just another example of me overreacting. Hearing that word again after surgery, after documentation, after everything, felt like confirmation rather than insult. It told me nothing had changed beneath the surface. When I asked him directly if he remembered my surgery and the restrictions, he shrugged and said everyone knew, but that it did not mean he had to treat me like glass. I wrote that down. When I asked if he had lifted and twisted me, he said he barely touched me. I asked him to demonstrate and he refused and said I was being ridiculous. I wrote that down too. My parents tried to broker a truce, suggesting a family meeting where everyone could speak openly and heal. I declined and said communication had already happened and been ignored. My mother cried and said she felt punished for loving both her children. I told her loving us equally would have required protecting us both. My father said I was being unforgiving. I said forgiveness follows accountability, not precedes it. The more I insisted on facts, the more they accused me of being cold. The irony was that calm precision was the only thing keeping me grounded. Without it, I would have drowned in their shifting explanations. They suggested therapy together, and I said I was already in care and that legal matters were separate. Ethan mocked the idea of mediation and said lawyers just wanted to bleed everyone dry. When I told him mediation was my preference, he laughed and said I would never follow through. That assumption fueled me more than anger ever could. The family version relied on my silence and compliance. Without those, it unraveled. They wanted me to accept a story where harm was accidental and accountability was optional. I wanted a record where actions matched outcomes. As weeks passed, their tone hardened. Calls became lectures. Messages became guilt-laden reminders of shared history. I listened without interrupting and then documented. The pattern did not surprise me anymore. It clarified. Every attempt to minimize only strengthened my resolve. I was not destroying the family narrative. I was refusing to carry it alone. By the time my attorney sent a formal notice, their outrage peaked and then fractured. Shock gave way to fear. Fear gave way to bargaining. My parents asked what it would take to make this go away. Ethan asked if we could just settle this quietly. I told them quiet does not mean hidden. It means resolved. The version of events they had crafted could not survive scrutiny because it required me to disappear again. I did not. And without me, the story collapsed under its own contradictions. The lawyer did not blink when I finished explaining what had happened, and that steadiness alone told me I had chosen the right person. He listened without interrupting and took notes, sparingly asking clarifying questions only when precision mattered. He asked about dates, times, witnesses, medical history, and prior knowledge, and he asked them in an order that made the story resolve into a clean sequence rather than an emotional tangle. When I told him about the prior surgery and Ethan knowing about it, he nodded once and circled a line on his page. When I described the lift and twist he asked me to demonstrate with my hands and then wrote applied force to weakened area without hesitation. He asked about the delay and the neighbor and the EMT statements and the surgeon language, and he smiled slightly when I mentioned mechanism of injury and documentation. He said those words were not accidental and that clinicians choose them carefully because they know charts can be scrutinized. He explained that there were multiple viable claims and laid them out plainly. Assault because unwanted physical contact caused harm. Negligence because Ethan breached a duty of care, knowing the risk and acting anyway. Intentional infliction of emotional distress given the pattern and the dismissive behavior afterward. He explained that we did not need to prove Ethan wanted me hurt, only that he knew the risk and disregarded it. He explained causation linking the force to the rupture and damages covering medical costs, pain suffering future risk, and loss of normal activity. He said the timeline was strong because imaging and operative notes anchored it, and because the delay documented worsening injury. He said the family gaslighting actually helped because it demonstrated consciousness of liability. When I asked about criminal charges, he was direct. He said prosecutors often hesitate in family cases without video or immediate neutral witnesses, and that even when charges are filed, they move slowly and outcomes vary. Civil action, he said, would move faster and put pressure where it mattered. He said mediation was appropriate and that my preference for it would make me look reasonable. He said numbers needed to be grounded and defensible, and that we would calculate them based on actual costs and projected impacts rather than punishment. I asked him what defenses he expected, and he listed them calmly. Accident, mutual horseplay, overreaction, pre-existing condition. He said our evidence neutralized each one. Accident fails when prior knowledge is documented. Horseplay fails when consent is absent and force is excessive. Overreaction fails when imaging and surgery exist. Pre-existing condition fails when a defendant exacerbates a known vulnerability. He said juries understand eggshell plaintiffs, even if families pretend they do not. He asked if there were messages, texts, or emails referencing my surgery or restrictions, and I told him there were casual mentions. He asked me to gather them and to preserve devices. He asked me to stop discussing the case with my family and to route communication through him. He said silence now would prevent contamination later. He explained next steps with clarity. Demand letter outlining facts, claims, and damages. Offer mediation. Exchange disclosures. Secure affidavits from medical providers if needed. He estimated weeks, not months. He said leverage increases when defendants realize the file is complete. I asked how families typically react, and he said they oscillate between denial and panic. He said that was normal. He said my job was to stay steady and let process do the work. He did not promise catharsis. He promised resolution. When I asked what he needed from me, he said accuracy, patience, and boundaries. He said, do not soften facts to spare feelings, and do not dramatize them either. He said truth lands hardest when it is unadorned. He explained fees and contingency and transparency and put everything in writing. He encouraged me to read it and ask questions. I did. He answered each one without defensiveness. Before we ended, he asked a final question. He asked what outcome I wanted beyond money. I told him I wanted acknowledgement that this was not a joke and that my pain was real. He nodded and said, settlements can carry statements of responsibility, even when they include confidentiality. He said we would seek language that reflected the medical findings. He said we would also protect my privacy and future. When I left his office, I felt lighter, not because the situation was resolved, but because it was finally contained within a structure that did not depend on my family agreeing with me. The law did not require their validation. It required facts. I had those. The lawyer did not blink because nothing I said surprised him. That was its own kind of relief. It meant this was not unprecedented or exaggerated. It was recognizable harm following a recognizable pattern. As we moved forward, I followed his guidance precisely. I stopped engaging in arguments. I preserved communications. I focused on recovery and documentation. When my parents called, I told them my counsel would be in touch. When Ethan texted, I did not respond. The quiet unsettled them more than any accusation would have. Within days, the demand letter went out and the tone of the conversation changed immediately. Fear replaced certainty. Questions replaced lectures. The lawyer called me to say mediation had been accepted pending dates. He said they wanted this contained. I told him that containment was acceptable as long as accountability was clear. He agreed. He said we were aligned. That alignment mattered. It meant I was no longer carrying this alone. Process had replaced chaos. Precision had replaced noise. And for the first time since that weekend, the outcome felt inevitable rather than uncertain. The settlement terrified them long before any number was spoken, and I could hear it in the way my parents' voices changed when my lawyer acknowledged receipt of their response. Fear has a sound when it replaces certainty, and it sounded like questions framed as concern and urgency disguised as love. They asked if there was a way to resolve this without ruining anyone, and my lawyer replied that resolution was the goal and that accountability was the path. When mediation was scheduled, my parents insisted on attending with Ethan, and their presence alone told me how exposed they felt. They had always assumed that if anything went wrong, they could absorb the shock together and smooth it over. Mediation threatened that assumption because it required facts to sit on the table without commentary. Before the date, my lawyer walked me through the numbers slowly and deliberately. He listed medical expenses already incurred, including surgery, hospitalization, imaging, anesthesia medications, and follow-up care. He added projected costs for physical therapy monitoring and potential complications. He included lost income and diminished capacity during recovery, not as punishment, but as arithmetic. He then explained pain and suffering and future risk in terms juries recognize and mediators respect. The total was not theatrical, it was restrained. That restraint was intentional. He said reasonable numbers frighten defendants more than outrageous ones because they look inevitable. When the figure was shared, their reaction confirmed that assessment. My mother cried immediately and asked how we could expect them to afford it. My father asked if insurance would cover anything, and my lawyer explained calmly why liability exclusions applied. Ethan asked if this was a threat, and my lawyer said it was an offer. Mediation began in a neutral room that smelled faintly of coffee and copier toner, and everyone sat as if posture could influence outcomes. The mediator set ground rules and emphasized confidentiality and process. I said little and listened. Ethan spoke first and minimized. My parents spoke next and reframed. The mediator asked questions and redirected them to specifics. When the surgeon's language was read aloud, the room went quiet. When timelines were displayed, the delay became visible. When the neighbor's call was mentioned, the excuse of confusion lost traction. My lawyer presented the settlement amount with a clear breakdown and explained how each category mapped to evidence. He did not raise his voice or appeal to sympathy. He spoke as if reading a ledger. That tone stripped the moment of drama and left only consequence. Ethan reacted with anger, then disbelief, then bargaining. He asked if this could be handled privately, and my lawyer said mediation was private and binding. He asked if we could lower the amount, and my lawyer asked what part of the evidence he disputed. Silence answered. My parents asked me to reconsider and reminded me of family history and shared memories. I said nothing. The mediator asked if anyone wanted a break, and they did. In the hallway, my mother pleaded and said this would destroy them. I said accountability had already arrived and that the settlement would decide its shape, not its existence. When we reconvened, the mediator proposed terms that reflected the offer with minor adjustments to payment structure rather than total amount. My parents asked about non-disclosure, and my lawyer explained its scope and limits. He made clear that it would protect privacy, not erase records. That distinction mattered. Ethan asked if the statement of responsibility could be softened, and my lawyer said medical findings would be referenced as documented. The phrase applied force to a weakened area appeared again and again like a refrain. By late afternoon, exhaustion settled over the room, and with it a willingness to conclude. The agreement was signed with a schedule that spread payments over time but preserved the total. As pens moved across paper, I watched my parents' hands shake and Ethan stare at the table. There was no triumph in that moment, only finality. The settlement terrified them because it removed ambiguity. Money quantified harm in a way arguments never could. It assigned weight to delay and to knowledge and to choice. When the mediator confirmed signatures, my lawyer closed his folder and said thank you. Outside, my parents asked if this meant we could heal now, and I said healing was personal and separate. Ethan said I had gone too far, and I said surgeons decide what is necessary. He laughed bitterly and said this was over a joke, and I said the surgeon called it trauma. The law called it liability. The agreement did not feel like revenge. It felt like gravity restored. Over the following weeks, the first payment arrived on schedule, and with it a silence that had been missing my entire life. Calls stopped, messages ceased. The fear that had driven their objections turned inward where it belonged. The settlement terrified them because it revealed what my pain had always been worth when someone finally measured it. It was only after the settlement papers were signed and the first payment cleared that Ethan seemed to understand this was not about forgiveness and never had been. Until then, he had treated the process like a misunderstanding that could be negotiated away with time, tone, and pressure. Once money changed hands, the illusion collapsed. He stopped pretending to be remorseful and started accusing me of betrayal with a sharpness that stripped away the last layer of civility. He said I had weaponized the system and turned a family issue into a public judgment. He said lawyers had poisoned my mind and that I had always been waiting for an excuse to hurt him. I listened without interrupting and noted how quickly his language shifted from minimizing harm to attacking my character. That shift was revealing. It showed that the apology had never been about accountability, only about avoiding consequence. When he said you are really doing this over one stupid joke, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The sentence clarified everything. In his mind, the defining feature of the event was still his intention to amuse himself, not the damage done to my body, or the knowledge he carried into that moment. I told him quietly that surgeons do not operate over jokes and that mediators do not sign agreements over misunderstandings. He scoffed and said I was being dramatic again, and I reminded him that drama does not require operative repair. He grew angry, then pacing and raising his voice, accusing me of destroying his future. He said employers would find out and that this would follow him forever. I told him confidentiality protected privacy, not reputation, and that consequences are not retroactive. He asked what I wanted from him now, and I said nothing. That answer frustrated him more than any demand could have. He wanted a role to play, and there was none left. Over the following weeks, his anger curdled into bitterness. He sent messages late at night blaming me for the strain on our parents and for the money they were paying on his behalf. He said I had always been fragile and that now I had proven it by running to lawyers instead of handling things like an adult. I did not respond. Silence had become my boundary, and it held. My parents tried once more to mediate, informally asking if we could all sit down and clear the air. I declined and said the matter had been resolved through the appropriate process. My mother said that sounded cold, and I said cold is sometimes another word for clear. Ethan attempted a final maneuver when he showed up unannounced at my apartment weeks later. He looked thinner and more tired than I remembered, and he launched into a speech about family loyalty and shared history. He said we had survived worse and that this should not define us. I listened from the doorway and told him to leave. When he asked if I was afraid of him, I said no and closed the door. That moment mattered because it was the first time I did not negotiate or explain. I did not need to convince him of anything. The agreement spoke for itself. Over time, the anger lost its audience and faded into resentment that stayed contained where it belonged. I focused on recovery and on rebuilding strength slowly and carefully. Physical therapy taught me to trust my body again without pushing it past what it could safely do. Each session reinforced the reality of what had happened and the work required to heal it. I learned how scar tissue behaves and how to protect the repair and how to recognize warning signs. That knowledge grounded me. It replaced fear with competence. When I returned to work, my colleagues accommodated my limitations without questioning them, and that simple respect highlighted how abnormal my family dynamic had been. Ethan tried once more months later to reframe the story through extended family gatherings, claiming we had a disagreement and lawyers had escalated it. The details did not stick because people sensed gaps and because he avoided specifics. The absence of my voice did not weaken the truth. It strengthened it. Those who mattered understood that boundaries do not require performance. They require consistency. The realization that this was not about forgiveness came with relief. Forgiveness would have asked me to absolve him of responsibility without restoring my safety. Accountability had already done what forgiveness could not. It acknowledged harm and changed behavior by imposing consequence. Ethan no longer tested limits or joked physically with anyone. The settlement had taught him something lectures never did. It taught him that his actions had weight beyond laughter and that the room would not always cushion his fall. I did not need him to agree with my perspective for that lesson to land. The process had done the teaching. When people asked how I felt about my brother now, I told them the truth, which was that I felt distance. Distance was not hatred. It was space enough to breathe. I carried the scar with me as a reminder of vulnerability and of repair. I also carried the clarity that came from choosing evidence over appeasement. The moment Ethan realized this was not about forgiveness was the moment the power dynamic finally shifted. He could no longer rewrite the past or bargain with the future. The matter was closed not emotionally, but structurally. That closure allowed me to move forward without looking back to see if anyone approved. Signing the papers did not feel dramatic, and that absence of spectacle was precisely what made the moment irreversible. The mediation room emptied slowly, and the mediator collected documents with practiced neutrality, while my lawyer reviewed the final pages one last time. Each signature had reduced a lifetime of chaos into enforceable terms, and that reduction stripped the family story of its power. When we stood to leave, my parents hovered as if waiting for instructions that would never come. Ethan lingered behind them, silent and rigid, and I recognized the posture from years earlier when consequences finally reached him and he did not know where to place the blame. Outside the building, the air felt different, lighter, and less charged, and I realized that the illusion of family had depended on my participation more than I had understood. Without my compliance, the structure could not stand. In the weeks that followed, the agreement did its quiet work. Payments arrived on schedule, and with them a series of small losses that accumulated into something visible. Ethan sold things he had once used as symbols of status and stopped attending events where his presence had been easy and unexamined. My parents adjusted plans and budgets and spoke in careful tones that avoided specifics. They asked less and told me less, and the distance became mutual rather than imposed. There were no dramatic confrontations or public scenes because none were required. The law had done what emotions never had and drawn lines that could not be crossed without cost. I felt grief then, not for the outcome, but for the years spent negotiating a place in a family that required my diminishment to function. Grief moved through me in waves, and I let it pass without fighting it. Therapy helped me name what I had learned and unlearn what no longer served me. I learned that loyalty without safety is not loyalty at all, and that peace built on silence is fragile by design. As my body healed, my confidence returned in ways that surprised me. Strength came back slowly and deliberately, and with it a trust in my own judgment that I had been trained to doubt. I began to make decisions without rehearsing how they would be received. I chose where to spend holidays and how to structure my time. I declined invitations without explanation and felt no guilt. The scar across my abdomen softened with time, but it remained visible enough to remind me of the line between play and harm. When people asked about it, I told the truth plainly and moved on. I did not owe anyone a performance. Ethan attempted to rebuild his version of events quietly and selectively, but without my participation, it lacked coherence. Stories require witnesses, and I was no longer available. The settlement included confidentiality, but it did not require denial, and that distinction protected me. I did not speak publicly, and I did not hide privately. Those who needed to know did, and those who did not were not entitled to details. Over time, the illusion of family dissolved into a series of relationships defined by distance and boundaries rather than obligation. That dissolution was painful, but it was also honest. I learned to recognize the difference. When the final payment cleared, my lawyer sent a brief confirmation and closed the file. The quiet that followed was not emptiness. It was space. In that space, I built routines that prioritized care and stability. I returned to activities I loved with modifications and patience. I slept better. I laughed without bracing. I noticed how rarely I flinched now when someone moved suddenly near me. That change mattered more than any document. On the anniversary of the surgery, I marked the day alone with a long walk and a simple meal, and gratitude that felt earned rather than demanded. I thought about the moment in the recovery room when the surgeon had named the injury and how that naming had shifted everything. Names have power when they align with truth. The illusion of family had relied on misnaming harm as humor and accountability as betrayal. The agreement had corrected that language, and with it the dynamic that language sustained. I did not reconcile with Ethan, and I did not seek to punish him further. The consequences already in place were sufficient. He lost money and ease and the unexamined authority he once enjoyed. My parents lost certainty and the ability to outsource conflict resolution to my silence. I lost the fantasy that things would change without cost. In exchange, I gained autonomy and a safety rooted in evidence rather than hope. The illusion was signed away not in anger, but in clarity. I understood then that endings do not always announce themselves with raised voices or slammed doors. Sometimes they arrive with initials on paper and a calm decision to step forward without looking back. That was the ending I chose, and it held. 1 year after the surgery, I stood in front of the mirror, tracing the thin, pale line that curved across my abdomen, and I felt neither anger nor pride, only recognition. The scar was evidence not of weakness, but of repair, and it reminded me that bodies tell the truth even when families refuse to. I moved through my days with steadier breath and a quieter mind, and the habits that once kept me small no longer ran the show. When people asked how I was, I answered honestly and briefly, and did not wait for permission to change the subject. My brother faded into the background of my life where unresolved noise belongs. The settlement did not give me closure so much as it returned authorship. I decided what the story meant and how it ended. He called it a joke. The surgeon called it trauma. The law called it liability. Those names held. I learned that justice does not have to be loud to be complete, and that boundaries enforced by process outlast promises made under pressure. On ordinary afternoons, I noticed small freedoms. I left rooms when I wanted to. I trusted my instincts without apology. I said no and did not soften it. Healing continued in increments measured by strength and sleep and confidence rather than time. The fear that once followed sudden movement loosened its grip, and I welcomed my body back as an ally. I kept copies of my records, but no longer read them. Preservation had done its work. When memories surfaced, I met them with fact, not fantasy, and they passed. I built a life that rewarded care and curiosity, and I chose relationships that did not require me to disappear. If there is a lesson here, it is not about vengeance. It is about precision. When harm is named accurately, it loses the power to masquerade as humor. When evidence is preserved, truth survives delay. When accountability is pursued calmly, it reshapes the future without spectacle. I am still careful. I am also free. The scar remains, and so does my resolve, and both are quiet. That quiet is the sound of safety finally earned. I carry forward with patience and clarity, choosing process over impulse and truth over comfort. I do not chase reconciliation or explanations because outcomes already exist. What matters is consistency and the courage to maintain it. Each boundary I keep is a repair stitch holding a better future in place. I will continue to live carefully and confidently, and I will protect what is fragile without apologizing. That is enough. I learned that survival can be quiet and justice can be humane, and both can coexist without spectacle or cruelty. This ending is stable, and I will keep it. Today, I choose calm over chaos and evidence over denial every single day. The work continues and the future is mine to guard. I move forward steady, certain, and whole. Nothing else is required now at last. If you stayed with me through this story, I want to ask you something honestly and without drama, because stories like this do not end when the last sentence is spoken. They continue in the lives of the people listening. How many times have you watched someone get hurt and heard it dismissed as a joke or a misunderstanding or just the way our family is? How many times have you felt your body react before your mind could justify it and then been told you were overreacting? If this story stirred anger or recognition or discomfort, that reaction matters because it means you understand the difference between intention and impact. I am not asking you to pick sides. I am asking you to name what you see. If someone knows a boundary and crosses it anyway, that is not play. If someone minimizes harm after it happens, that is not love. If a family protects the person who caused damage and pressures the injured one to stay quiet, that is not unity. That is control. I share this not to invite outrage, but to invite clarity. For those of you who have lived something similar, I want you to know that you are not weak for needing evidence, and you are not cruel for seeking accountability. Quiet justice is still justice. Precision is still strength. If you are watching from a place where family expectations feel heavier than your own safety, pause and consider what protecting yourself could look like if you stopped negotiating with people who benefit from your silence. If you are watching as someone who once laughed things off, I ask you to think about the cost of that laughter and who paid it. Accountability does not destroy families. Avoidance does. If you are a parent or a sibling or a friend, this is your moment to decide which role you play when harm happens. Do you minimize to keep things comfortable, or do you listen to the person in pain even when it complicates the room? If this story resonated, share where you are watching from and what stood out to you, because community matters when truth feels isolating. If you disagree, say why, but be specific. Vague dismissal is how harm survives. Precision is how it ends. And if you need help, start with documentation, start with facts. Start with someone outside the system that keeps telling you to calm down. You do not owe anyone your silence. You owe yourself safety. If you want to hear more stories like this told without sensationalism and without excuses, stay here and engage because visibility changes outcomes. This space exists to name what others gloss over and to show that accountability does not require shouting to be effective. Your voice matters when it is grounded in truth. Drop a comment, share your perspective, and remember this. He called it a joke. The body called it trauma. The law called it liability.